You are listening to Action Design, your monthly insight into the field of behavioral economics and its applications to the world around us. We bring you leading practitioners from all industries to discuss cutting-edge behavioral research and how to practically apply those concepts to the development of consumer products and public policy.
Well, welcome everybody to another invigorating episode of Action Design Radio. I'm Eric Johnson. This is my co-host, Zarak Khan. Say hello, Zarak.
Hi, everybody.
So eager. Where are you? So last time you recorded, Zarak was in, I believe, Cape Town, South Africa. Where are you this time around?
Equally exotic, Durham, North Carolina. So if anyone guessed Durham, North Carolina, you win a free ticket to join me on my weekend brunch tour of Durham.
Wow, that's quite the prize.
It's quite an honor.
And we're very happy to be joined today by Sarah Newcomb, who is I'm fortunate to be one of my teammates on the Behavioral Insights team at Morningstar. So we'll be discussing a lot of in-depth topics, especially about the psychology of money with Sarah today. So we'll start diving into that. We'll say Zarak and I, it's that kind of time of the year, and everybody's getting colds, and Zarak and I are a little bit stuffed up, but as they say, the show must go on and the pod must go on, and through sickness and in health, we record the Action Design podcast. So
That's right.
So with that, I think we'll get started here. So I think to start, I mean, generally we like to get started by just kind of having the, whoever our guest is sort of give a little bit of background on what they do and a little bit of how they get into the field. And I think especially for this episode, it's particularly relevant. Sarah, I think your background really leads well into kind of how you got into the field, into kind of your areas of expertise really well. So yeah, if we could start off and talk, first a little bit about what you do now, and then a little bit your path to how you sort of discovered behavioral science and psychology more broadly, and how you kind of ended up in this kind of area of expertise you're in.
Yeah, great. Well, first of all, thanks guys for having me on. I'm really excited for this conversation, and like you said, my background and my work are really intricately tied. I got into behavioral science and behavioral economics mostly because I was trying to fix my own issues with money, which were many and deep. And I couldn't figure out why at 28, with a degree in math, why I was still so poor. and it seemed like there was never enough, and I remember this moment that I had where I realized, I'm good with numbers. There is no reason why I shouldn't be good with money. If it has anything to do with numbers, then I should be great at this. And I decided, first of all, there must have been something else going on. And that was sort of my first insight into money and psychology, that it wasn't about understanding numbers. And I think that's one big misconception out there. You do not have to be good with numbers to understand money. And being good with money really is very much not about the numbers. So basically, I decided that if it was a logical exercise, that I wanted to tackle it logically. And so I leveraged my math degree to get into financial planning school and did my master's certification in personal financial planning. I thought, look, I'm just going to learn how the experts do it. And if I can understand the fundamental theorem of calculus, then I can understand money. So I went after it that way.
Seems logical.
And it was really interesting, right? Because I thought, look, if this is a logical exercise, then I should be able to get it. But what was really interesting was as I, took all the classes in tax law and estate planning and wills and trusts and benefits packages and investments and portfolio management and all the things about money, I realized that, knowledge about how to manage your money really isn't the key either. because knowing how to manage a portfolio didn't change the day-to-day choices I was making that meant that I didn't have money to invest in the first place. And I kind of assumed that I was just bad with money, that maybe it was just kind of a personality trait. And I think a lot of people feel that way. They just say, oh, I'm just not good with money. Then I took a class in psychology and financial planning, and that was the class that changed my life. My professor from that class was actually recently quoted in a really great article in the New York Times called "I'm Rich and That Makes Me Anxious." He came into our classroom talking about the very same topic from that article. He was preparing us as financial advisors to be prepared for the client who would come into our office one day feeling totally stressed out because he was only making $5 million a year.
We can all relate, yeah.
Right? And so that's the thing, is like, how would we handle that? Would we judge this person, or would we recognize someone who, lives in the shadow of their parents' huge fallout with money, and just there's no number that will ever make them feel safe? And on the other hand, you have people who, it's not that it doesn't matter how much they have. They never feel like they can measure up. The whole point that I got from that class, and the thing that changed my life, was the recognition that money management has almost absolutely nothing to do with numbers. It's about the stories that we tell ourselves. It's about what those numbers mean to us. The figure $5 million means something to me. It means something to you. It means something totally different to someone else. For someone, that number means utter failure. For other people, it's more than they can possibly imagine ever having. But it's not about the number. It's about what that number translates into in terms of who you believe you are. And that is where the power of money management comes in. And so for me, I had to really take a look at my personal stories with money. And that was when I started to realize that my financial narrative, my story when it came to money represented inequality and exploitation and barriers and greed and all the things that I felt resentful and angry about. And so it was no wonder when I looked at it why I was resisting having it, because I was afraid it was going to corrupt me. And I didn't know that. I was reacting to that belief without even knowing I had the belief. Does that make sense? So then once I was able to recognize that I had this belief that money was somehow inherently evil, and that people who wanted it and who sought after it were inherently greedy and bad, then I could start to ask myself real questions like, do I believe that's true? And how is that belief serving me? And who taught me that? And why? Where did that come from? And is that belief serving them? And I was really able to take that step. I really believe it's just a step in psychological and emotional maturity that we make in other areas of our life, where we come into adulthood and we have to take stock of the messages and the stories that we've been told about life itself. And we have to ask ourselves, do I believe this is true? Am I carrying this with me into the next stage of my life? We do that in so many other areas of our life, but we don't think to do it with money and with our beliefs about money. So at that point, I decided I didn't want to be a financial planner. I wanted to help other people like me who were smart and ambitious and motivated, but stuck for reasons they didn't even understand, to get unstuck. And that's why I did a doctorate in economics and psychology, was to dig deeper into the ways that we get ourselves stuck without realizing it.
So that idea of stories, it's funny because it wasn't what I was expecting necessarily when I picked up a book that was it's about financial planning sort of, and about kind of money management. And, the first half of the book is largely dedicated to stories, where stories come from, these kind of narratives that we tell ourselves. And, so part of it, it kind of struck me that, the point that you just made about we come to a certain point in our lives and we start to question other things, like where do we get this, this narrative or this belief from? We don't necessarily do that with money. And part of it, I think, might be, one of the points that you make early on, just like, it's something that we don't really talk about. It's like we don't talk about it, but it's ever present, And, in some ways it's like kind of just this sort of, like I was thinking about like, oh yeah, choice architecture sort of does make sense in here because like it's something that like your whole upbringing and stuff, you're exposed to this in various ways. It sort of imprints itself on you. What's your take on, kind of now that you've trained as a behavioral scientist as well, like the effect that an intervention can have over the long term where, you're trying to work against forces or change a narrative that has been sort of like built up in you for as long as you can remember, even to the point where you don't even really necessarily know where the story came from in the first place. You have to do some like self-examination to even find that out.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do believe that as humans we can change.
Before you jump into your answer, is to clarify, the book you're referencing is Sarah's book, Loaded. Which we
should have said the name of that way before now.
Yeah, we should have said that way earlier. But so Sarah has an amazing book called Loaded, which dives into a lot of this. So we'll cover how to cover that earlier, but just to make sure we're clear on that for the audience. So,
thanks, Eric. Thanks for the product placement there. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so first of all, I do believe that we can change, and even deep beliefs and core beliefs can be changed. But I like that you brought up choice architecture because the way that I think about my work and as a behavioral economist, I operate differently from what most behavioral economics focuses on. And the way that I like to think of it is this. When you think about choice architecture, a lot of times what people are doing is they're changing the construction of the environment in which someone is making a decision. That's what choice architecture is. You change the environment and maybe you change the behavior. Well, there are two different environments that are involved in every decision we make. There's the environment, the external environment, and there's our internal environment. And I work on changing that internal landscape, changing the internal model, our mental model that we create and do our cost-benefit analysis on, that mental picture. That's where I try to do my work. So there are many behaviors that we can nudge through external choice architecture, but there are a lot of financial decisions that we really can't nudge. Like you can't necessarily nudge someone to not take out a second mortgage on their home to pay for their kids' college because they really should be thinking about their retirement. That's not really something that a nudge is going to be able to do, but helping them to recognize that they have a story in their mind that goes something like a good parent pays for college, and getting them to recognize that that story may be threatening their stability, But it's that story that's in their internal environment that's shaping their decision. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And I like how you sort of laid it out in the book as well. Like, it's funny, as I was going through the book Loaded by Sarah Newcomb, as I was going through, I would write down questions or like, I wonder like what, how this, relates to this other thing. And then almost as soon as I wrote down the question, it's like, oh, this next section just answers that for me. Like, this is like just a very well-structured book. And that was one of the things that I was like, oh, there's like, a lot of talk about sort of the stories that we tell ourselves and like understanding where these come from and kind of getting to the sense of core beliefs. And, as I was reading, I was like, yeah, but like, how do you do that? And then like, the next section, these are questions you should ask yourself to understand, right, like if this is kind of where you're going. So I appreciated that because I was like, Well, I
appreciate you saying that. That always makes me feel good to know that someone has had that kind of experience with it. Do you know how I made that magic happen? I've made all the mistakes. And I've done and thought each of these things. And so I think that by having to really rewrite my core beliefs and my programming when it comes to money, my cultural and social operational system, in navigational system. I've walked it. And so what that book is, honestly, is it's a culmination of all the aha moments that I've had over the 10 years of research and personal exploration in the, leading up to the writing of that book, collected so that, all of the complexity of consumer psychology, marketing psychology, business psychology, cognitive psychology, economics, finance, art, accounting, all of that. I wrestled through the complexity of all of that, found the connecting points, and got to the simplicity on the other side of it. And then I wrote it all down so that you don't have to wrestle with all of it.
Right. Well, and and this might kind of answer my next question, which is, as I was reading, one of the notes that I wrote was just like, this topic is so broad, like there's such breadth there. Like, the fact that you were kind of coming at it partly from your own lens of like personal experience, did that help you scope the book at all? Because like, I just remember thinking like several times, like, man, like how did she decide like this is sort of where to like kind of draw the parameters around this? Because it's like a topic an issue that touches so many parts of people's lives and relationships and careers and economy and everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll tell you that the most challenging part of writing that book was deciding what didn't go into it. Trying to figure out just that. What is the scope? I don't remember exactly how I did it. I just remember it was hard.
Yeah.
and coming out on the other end of it, I felt like there was a continuity to it that I felt very proud of. So I at the same time, there's so much that isn't in there. But I think one of the hardest things about doing this work is recognizing that there is no one answer for anyone, and yet I still want to be helpful. So really what it comes down to is understanding our cultural exposure, understanding what we think is true that's really just contextual, and then realizing what we should be challenging and the questions we should be asking ourselves. There is no answer that I can give that's correct, but I can lead you to really useful questions that if you answer for yourself, you're going to feel so much more clear on the other end of it.
Yeah, and I think talking about that is kind of why I think like a lot of like your work and the work in the book and kind of the research work you do stands out to me compared to a lot of what we tend to see in sort of this kind of popular behavioral science industry. And that I really liked how you made the discernment of there's kind of the internal and external environments. And almost everything that we read about and kind of talk about in most of the stuff is the external environment. And all these kind of behavioral change products and things are really just, a lot of it comes down to making things easier, making things clearer for people that, I think are ready to take an action, And I think often we make the mistake in behavioral science of kind of assuming everybody's just ready to change and that like all they need is the right tool and the right nudge to make it happen. But it's really so much more complicated than that. 'Cause it's really that internal and those stories you mentioned that really kind of drive a lot of what we do, and like you said, like no nudge or tool is necessarily going to take care of that until they sort of answered that. So to me, that really stands out. So I'd like to kind of dive into that a little bit more and talk about, like you mentioned, sort of the stories. So like, explain a little bit more what you mean about kind of these internal stories people have, and especially from the money perspective, which is kind of your expertise. And really, you could apply this to like any area, like health, career, anything. But, you talk a little bit about what you mean kind of by stories and what some of the most common ones tend to be as they relate to money. And then maybe we can switch that and sort of think about from the application perspective, like understanding that people have these stories, like how do we how do we build products and solutions that don't just address that external, but also address those stories, that internal environment?
Okay, so there's several questions there, right? So what do I mean by stories? So when I say stories, what I'm talking about are our core beliefs about money. And something that Zarak mentioned was that, we don't talk about money directly. But it's ever present. It's everywhere. It's in our songs. It's in our movies. It's in our literature. It's in the clothes that we wear or the clothes that we don't wear. It's in the places that we shop or the places that we don't shop. The places that we eat or the places that we don't eat. The places that our kids go to school or that we wouldn't ever let them go to school. We're constantly sending each other social signals based on money and class. Because money is a socioeconomic thing, but we focus on the economic part of it. But it's a socioeconomic phenomenon. And it's intricately tied in with our sense of worth and place in the world and our sense of tribe and who we belong to. And we have ways now of marking our ownership and our membership in our tribes through external shows of wealth, or sometimes the willful rejection of wealth. There's so many messages about money, about what having it means, about who you are and who you're not, about what not having it means. And there is not a consensus around what is good. You know, the rich blame the poor for being poor. The poor think the rich are evil for being rich. Everybody shames everybody else and feels guilt and shame for their own situation. And we don't talk about these things. And because we don't talk about them, they continue to be really unhealthy things in our lives. So I can't think of anything in the world that we don't openly talk about that we also happen to have a very healthy relationship with. The things that we keep in the dark tend to be the things we feel ashamed of. And so for me, I'm kind of on a mission to get people to, if not talk openly with others about money, at least talk honestly with themselves about money. And because I think that that's the first step to having a healthy relationship with money. And not everybody is plagued by a terrible relationship with money. But those of us that have a complex one, and I would say most of the people I've talked to have something of a conflicting relationship with money, all of us tend to have issues. And if we want to be free, if we want to live well and then because money affects so much of what we do in our lives, we can't escape needing to understand it. So as far as what types of stories people have, I think they fall into two general camps. They can either, like any core belief that you have about money, could probably fall into either the money is good or money is bad category, right? Money is good or money is evil. And it's sometimes seen as this tool, which is more accurate. And yet we can't really avoid attaching emotions to it because every one of us has had an experience with it growing up. So when it comes to what is a story about money, I think one of the ways that people can figure out what their own core beliefs are is to take an evening and write out your financial story. Just write your life story with respect to money. So what was your exposure to, what was your financial life like growing up? What kinds of things did you hear? What examples did you see? What really stood out to you? How did you feel? When was the first time that you noticed that other people had more than you or less than you? How did that feel? What did that, those types of things. And if you write that story out, generally, money has it plays a role. It's almost like a character in your life story. And for some of us, that character is helpful. And for others, that character is antagonistic. And that will really affect how you feel about money. And so that's one really good place to start, is to just think about your own history with money and think, if it were a character in my life story, would it be a friend or an enemy? Another thing that people can do is write their narrative and then distill it down to, you know how fables, there's always the moral at the end of the story, right? And the moral is, well, most of us, if we write our story out, we've already sort of turned it into a theme, you know? So if you were to say, and the moral of my life story with money is blank, fill that in. If you can say that in one sentence, then you've gotten to a core belief about money. So for me, growing up, I realized that when I had a really unhealthy relationship with money, I believed that axiom, money is the root of all evil. And I believed that money corrupts people. And those messages affected my financial decisions without me realizing it. So once I realized it, then I could start to challenge them.
As I was reading through the book, you can't help but like apply these things to your own life. And I don't want not to give away too much of the book, because I do think people should buy it and read it because it's fantastic. But could you talk a little bit about the difference between a strategy and a need? Because that was something that I'd never really thought of before in that way, and I found that extremely helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this does tie into stories in a way, because what happens is that our core beliefs, so whatever messages about money that we're surrounded with in life, we internalize some of them. And then those become our core beliefs. You know, it might be money doesn't grow on trees, or it might be, hard work pays off. It might, whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. And then that affects your belief, because what happens is that each one of us is trying to live our lives. Each one of us has a set of human needs that we are trying to satisfy. And then we go out in the world and we try to meet those needs. And whatever our stories about money are, affect how we use money to meet our needs. So if, for example, you believe that, and this is one that I think a lot of men get, unspoken message, but very, very pervasive, women want a man who can provide for them. You have to be financially secure if you're going to succeed in a, sorry for the hetero perspective there. But I think that that's a very common belief for men, that they have to be able to provide. Okay. So if you internalize that belief, then you go out and, in order to meet your need to feel like a good person, your need to feel competent and independent, then you may take a job that you hate just because that need for sex, for relationship, for connection, for family, for the life that you want, in your mind, all depends on you having a certain number in the bank. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's just one example. But in terms of the overall needs and strategies concept, there is a theory of human motivation that Abraham Maslow came up with. Everybody that's ever taken Psychology 101 knows about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And the way that this theory goes is that we satisfy our basic needs for, air and food and sleep first. And then once those are satisfied, then we can start to think about our higher order needs like safety and security. And then once those are secure, then we can start to think about emotional needs like friendship and connection and love and belonging. And then once we have that, then we start to think about esteem and respect. And then once we have that, then we can think about self-actualization and reaching our highest potential. And the theory goes that these are hierarchical, that we meet one first and then the next. But what most people don't know is that when Maslow died, he wasn't sure it was a hierarchy at all. And what's really interesting when this comes to money management, I mean, there's the obvious thing that all those things take money. But most of us, when we learn to budget, we're taught you need to know the difference between a want and a need. right? That you need to know, what you need and what's not really essential. And the problem that I have with that is that the assumption that relies on is that if you don't need it to survive, if it's not that first order need, that you don't need it. But it's not Maslow's hierarchy of wants. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Right.
And the reality is that anyone who fasts for religious reasons is putting their need for meaning and for spiritual connection above their need for food, at least temporarily. Anybody who texts while driving is putting their need for connection and communication above their need for safety. We're constantly flipping the hierarchy on its head. And what this idea of knowing the difference between a want and a need teaches people to do is to devalue the needs that are actually the most important to us. Yes, we need to survive, but without meaning and love and connection, do you want to survive? Those are the things that we survive for. So to say that we don't need those things is to really do what budgeting does and create a plan for feeling deprived. Mm-hmm. Because if you say you only need the things that help you survive, then all those other things are now no longer responsible to spend money on them. When really love and connection are often far more important to us than some of the more basic stuff. So the point here is that we're prioritizing what we should do. And again, these are cultural norms. They're these big shoulds that we get from our external environment. And then they conflict with what's going on inside of us. And this is why we don't behave the way we think we should, because the shoulds don't line up with who we are. So I did a lot of research on human motivation. And there's one researcher who, he's a psychologist, Marshall Rosenberg, created this approach to conflict management that I think is just absolutely genius and just really cuts through to the heart of why we do what we do. And his theory is they're all just needs. That yes, you can organize them according to category, but it's not a hierarchy. Love is a need, just as safety is a need, just as food is a need. And these are all needs. And our needs don't go away just because we decide that we can't afford them. They're still there because they're human needs. In order for humans to feel good, we need love. Meaning. We need to know that we belong. We need respect. We need friendship. We need so many things that are not in that bottom tier for survival. And this is why we spend our money. This is every single financial decision that we make is an attempt to meet one of those fundamental human needs. Even like a little impulse purchase at the end of the aisle in Target could be meeting your need for fun, for convenience, for ease and relaxation, whatever, for giving. So the point is that everything we do is an attempt to meet a fundamental human need. So if we budget from the perspective that we can only spend money on things that are survival needs, then we will always kick ourselves and hate ourselves because we're going to find ourselves breaking that budget. We're going to find ourselves doing what we think we shouldn't do. But if we budget from the perspective that we have a set of human needs that we need to satisfy, we also have a limited amount of resources to use. Now, how can I change my strategies for meeting those needs so that all of them get satisfied without exhausting my budget? And the way that you start to do that is if you do your budget and you realize you need to save more or you want to save more, then instead of just cutting something out, saying, okay, well, I can't afford my texting plan or I can't afford Spotify, you go, okay, what need am I meeting with that expense? Because right now, if I'm doing it, it's a strategy to meet a need. So the thing isn't the need, the thing is the strategy The need is on Maslow's hierarchy, so you can always find it there. If you ever wonder what are my needs, just look up Maslow's hierarchy. That's what they are. We've all got them. They're all the same. Our needs don't change. Our strategies for meeting those needs, that's where we have flexibility. And that's where budgeting actually becomes sort of a fun, creative problem-solving exercise. And how am I going to meet all of these needs so that I feel awesome? And like that need for long-term safety, totally met. And that need for fun and its excitement and adventure, totally met. Zarak, I think you're a great example of that. You are working and you have stability and you also have so much freedom in where you're working from and what you're doing. And you've managed to meet both of those needs at the same time. You didn't sacrifice one to the other. Do you know what I mean? That's a strategy, the strategy of remote working that is opening itself up to more people right now than it was in the past. But that strategy that's a strategy to meet your needs for fun, adventure, seeing the world, for excitement, for whatever, I don't know what list of needs you're meeting with that, but you're also
your stories now, Zarak.
Yeah.
Well, I was about to say, if there's a volume 2 coming out, you don't even have to change my name to use my story. You can just put me right in there.
Yeah, but so I think it's just a shift. It's a small shift in the way that we define things, but it makes a big shift in the way that we think. So the change in saying, I don't need to know the difference between a want and a need because they're all needs. I need to know the difference between a need and a strategy for meeting that need. I don't need a car. I need transportation. The car is a strategy. There's a number of other strategies for getting that same need met, and each of them has a different price tag associated. I don't need to go to Starbucks. I need to get out of the office.
Mm-hmm.
Going to Starbucks is one way of doing it, And so when you start to train yourself to take each item on your expenses list and figure out what needs you're meeting with it, then you can find an alternate strategy for meeting the need that doesn't cost as much. If you take the traditional route and just cut the thing off, say, I can't afford it, I'm not going to spend money on it, you will feel deprived because what you've done is you've decided that whatever need you're meeting, you're just not going to do that anymore. And that's why we all hate budgeting, and that's why we never keep our budgets. But the goal is to be able to manage your money in a way that you feel amazing now and later.
Yeah, it's funny. Like we had a conversation. Erik and I had a conversation a couple weeks ago with Mariel Beasley, who is a director of the Common Sense Lab, and one of the things we talked about was budgeting and how, basically, the first thing that you ask people to do is the most painful. The typical way of doing it, it's it's awful, It's okay, I think we were, Erik maybe compared it to just okay, it's if you were starting a diet, it's all right, now sit down and calculate every single calorie that you eat, and then what you want to start cutting out. It's very, kind of counterintuitive. Just there's a lot of you pay a high sort of mental cost and emotional cost to do that, right at the outset. And so I liked the way that you set this up of kind of tying it back to, starting with your sort of story and kind of tying back these costs to actual needs, and your inclusion of sort of the golden rules. I think golden rule around what is it, a need or a strategy? It made it very easy to sort of tell the difference, because when I was first reading it, I was oh yeah, there were definitely things that I thought of as needs that were strategies.
Can you think of one? Because I'd love to hear you talk for a little bit.
Yeah.
I had some ideas for some examples we could walk through to try them at home, so let's rock it.
Yeah, well, you're the first podcast person to say that they wanted me to talk more. But no, well, I mean, I love the so it's one of the examples that you gave kind of resonated with me of you're working with someone, or it was I think a family member or something like that, where it's they always have this need to kind of prove you wrong, or the need to be right, And it's like, oh no, that's not a need, which is like, I would have thought like, oh yeah, that's like a need to sort of be correct all the time. Like that's a need. Like, no, that's a strategy to feel valued or to feel that, you have like the esteem of somebody else. That was when I was like, oh yeah, like that's something that I wouldn't have thought of that way before. But I do now. Yeah.
Yeah, and the golden rule for understanding whether something is a need or a strategy is if everybody can't have it at the same time, it's not a need, it's a strategy. So everybody can't be right. So what might being right be a strategy for? Why being right? What are they getting out of? What need are they getting out of feeling that they're right? Oh, maybe they need to know that they're important. Maybe they need to feel heard. Those are things everybody can have at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like this whole approach, what like stands out, what makes it so like it seems so obvious in hindsight in a lot of ways, but like which is good. Like a lot of the best behavioral insights seem very obvious in hindsight, But what I like about the most is it's like empowering, like what we do in a lot of things. I think personal finance is one of the worst areas of this, where it just feels it's painful, it's hard. It's all about not doing things you like to do. Like, these weary millennials spending all this money on their phones and, taking
avocado
trips,
toast.
Avocado toast. They're like, if you just didn't go to the bar ever, like, if you just didn't go out to the bar with your
if you
friends,
just didn't have a social life, you'd
and
be
like
fine.
people listen to that and they're just like, so the only way I get ahead in my financial life is just literally not do anything, have no friends.
The wealthiest hermit on the mountain.
Yeah. And
exactly.
We always focus on taking stuff away and not enjoying, but you can, it shifts it from being more opportunistic and empowering, and that you can, that you don't necessarily have to make a choice. Like you still have to make sacrifices and you have to put the time in to be creative about this, but it doesn't have to be this big loss and, the sacrifice of like the life that you want. Like a parallel that I see this a lot is like in kind of like dieting. Whereas when people think of eating healthy, it's just like, oh man, but I love cookies. Like, oh man, like how could I not eat bread all the time? Like that just sounds so painful. And like, for me, like I'm pretty into healthy eating and stuff, and I eat healthy, but I also never feel like I know recipes that I like a lot, and so I never really feel like I'm missing anything. So I'm eating stuff that tastes good to me and that I like, and that also like fits my, dietary goals or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy, because I reject the idea that we need to either enjoy our lives now or later. Mm-hmm. And the idea of, well, you sacrifice now so that you can live well later, that, maybe I'm just too short-term a thinker, but it doesn't, that is uninspiring. And I feel like, we don't know how much time we have. And so then you end up with this feeling of, well, I'm just, YOLO, I'm just going to, do it all now. And then, right. Again, it's either or, but I really believe it doesn't have to be, which is why if you think about things in terms of needs rather than wants, then you can start to say, okay, I am going to the bar 3 nights a week because I really, really enjoy hanging out with my friends. How can I have that same kind of contact and connection with them without spending as much money? Can I be designated driver once a week so that I'm only drinking, the free soda that the bartender gives me? I'm the hero and I don't have to split the bill with everybody, or, can I have people come over once a week? Like how can I get the need for, because you realize then, okay, the need I'm meeting here is not for drinks, or appetizers and bar food. The need that I'm meeting is for connecting with my friends. So how can I do that in a way that costs less money? And what you find when you do that is that a lot of times the alternate strategies that you come up with tend to actually meet more needs than you were meeting beforehand. So an example of this, when I was talking to financial advisors about this, I always have them do an exercise where one of them is the advisor and the other one is a client, and the client comes in with some sort of, overspending thing that they need to rein in. And of course, what they do is they bring in their own spending habits and they try to fix themselves, which is great.
Lo and behold, financial advisors have some of the same problems that we all have. It's like when you see a doctor smoking. It's like
yeah, exactly. So I loved it. These two guys at one conference, they got up and told their story, and the guy who had been the client, he he was spending too much money on his boat. And so I was like, okay, so what needs do you meet when you're on your boat? And he started talking about the wind in his hair and the sun on his face. And I'm like, yep, that's why this guy has his boat. He's not meeting, for him, it has nothing to do with ego. It has nothing to do with any of that. It is about the wind in his hair and the sun on his face. And if he didn't have his boat, his life quality would go down intensely. So you can't say to somebody, oh, you can't have the wind in your hair and the sun.
Switch to a riding lawnmower, buddy.
Right. So he was like, well, so the first thing that came to their mind was, oh, get a smaller boat or something. But as they got more creative, his face lit up when he described the new strategies. He realized that he could offer sailing lessons to some of the teenagers at his yacht club. And in that way, he could not only offset the cost of his boat so that he was boating for less money, essentially, but he could also really be mentoring the next generation. And he was so excited by this strategy. So he's effectively he's actually increasing his income, but offsetting the cost of his boat and meeting this other need for nurturing the next generation and feeling important. And it was just really cool to see. And that happens so often when you take this approach, because you're not thinking in terms of how can I get by on less. The question you're asking is, how can I feel as awesome as possible with the resources that I have?
Yeah, so I was trying to think about that in sort of a behavioral science perspective, and that we always default to like the easiest path to something, So if he likes boating, the natural default is, I'm just going to buy a boat and sail that boat. And then taking that little bit extra effort to think beyond the obvious gets you to that, oh, I could offer lessons and, feel enriched and give back to my community and also support my habit in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of it is just thinking deeper and spending money at bars is another example where you have this social need, and the most common way that, most people meet that social need is going out to bars. But, maybe you find a way to make going to bars cheaper. Maybe you find fitness groups that you get to know people or something, like a running club. So not only are you satisfying that need, but you're also getting exercise that you want to do anyway. And it's a good lesson in thinking that, we always default to whatever that easy and obvious path is. But just somebody give it 10 minutes, that example you share about the boat, that couldn't have been more than 5 minutes of discussion.
They had less than 5 minutes of discone.
Yeah, and the thing of just literally spending 5 to 10 minutes to think a little bit deeper, how could I do this in a different way? For one, it's fun, as you come up with new stuff like that, and it's really just simply pushing yourself to go beyond the obvious. Such a good habit to be in a lot of ways. Those sorts of things.
Well, so it's funny you say that, because I do agree with that, but it actually kind of. There was a question that I had about sort of how this fits into some of the recent research that's come out around scarcity, and so basically thinking about how people and I know that you address this to some extent in the sections where you're talking about kind of privilege and lack, but thinking about how people make decisions in resource poor settings, and one of the findings from this sort of field of study, or this specific book that I'm thinking of by Sindel Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir, is that folks who are often in kind of poor settings, they use their mental bandwidth on other things, and so they have less time to think about decision making, or sorry, they have less time to do some of this kind of planning and some other stuff that requires more decisions. And it's funny because I was actually, I'm not in a resource poor setting, but I, just the other day, I was coming back from a bunch of travel and I was exhausted and had been flying for, felt like 36 hours or something like that. And I got back and I was reading this, I had an email, I was kind of catching up on emails, and one of them was hey, it's from my company. It was hey, we see that, you had a change of address. Your health insurance plan, it doesn't cover where you currently are, so you have to switch to a new one, it's going to lapse. And it's a fairly important decision, fairly big thing. And it's just nope, can't do it. I opened it up and it was I think this is a pretty easy thing for me to do. I just basically pick a different, like, okay, that one, just like pick a different one. And I started looking through, and it was like, all right, like, here's your copay, and here's the thing. And I like started reading it through, and like, I've made this decision probably, I don't know, 10 times before, something like that. So it's not, I'm familiar with it already. And it was just like, in this moment, I was like, no, I just do not have the effort inside me to go through this thing. And so I was kind of thinking, like, you know, a lot of the things that you mentioned here, it's sort of like, as Erik was sort of saying, like taking that extra step, thinking for an extra 5 or 10 minutes and getting a little bit more creative with it, which I wholeheartedly agree are, I mean, like, you come up with fantastic ideas. But what do you think about like the applicability for folks who are in the settings where they might not have that same bandwidth?
Yeah. So I think, you know, when you're talking about energy and cognitive resources, being poor is really, really exhausting. It's a constant, chronic stress, and it wears you down. I know because I've been there. And yeah, the idea of, just think a little deeper, just be creative. I am in no way victim blaming. I am in no way saying that people who are poor should just think deeper. I think, and I appreciate you bringing it up, because I don't ever want the message of financial psychology that I teach to get conflated with the just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Some people literally do not have bootstraps, and there are systemic and societal things that are keeping people down that we have to fix. So that said, I think that when you're in a resource poor environment, there is some really interesting research on social support and how that can help people who are bound in chronic stress and rumination over financial issues. So what happens cognitively is exactly what you said. The stress and the immediate needs of your daily life, they shorten your time horizon. So you literally can't see tomorrow because today's pressures are just too much. You have enough bandwidth to think about right now, and that's it. And what happens with that is that then people are more at risk to take on high debt to income ratios, to get into like payday lending situations where they're really preyed upon, and it digs them deeper and deeper, and it becomes a terrible poverty trap and negative feedback loop, where your financial stress leads to poor financial choices, which leads to more financial stress. Then you've got situations where if you live in a food desert, you know, now you've also got lower cognitive functioning because the food you have access to is terrible. You know, all these things add up to the fact that when you're in a poverty trap, you have to be more perfect than anyone else with your money. And that's the thing that is really terrible, that the less you have, the fewer mistakes you can make, because people who have slack can make bad financial decisions and not feel it for a while. But when you're poor, every cent counts, and every decision really either keeps you afloat or hurts. And the chronic stress of that then does exhaust you. And at the end of the day, you're like, I just can't. I know I just need to click a button, and I just don't have it in me. So I hear you, and I get it. And what some research is showing in that is that when people are stuck in financial rumination and their stress over their financial situation is overwhelming, when they think of 3 people that they can confide in, if they just spend a minute thinking of the people that they can confide in, not even rely on financially, but just think about people who've got your back emotionally. And what happens is that that sense of social support then helps people stop ruminating. And you can then think a little bit longer. It's something in knowing that you're not alone, knowing that somebody's got your back, helps you take a breath. And when you take a breath, then you can think a little bit longer. So some really, really cool research on rumination and social support is showing that people who think about their friends and the social support network that they have, then subsequently make better financial choices. At least, I don't know how long the effect lasts,
right.
but we know that at least in the immediate term, they make better financial choices. I think a lot of this is tied into the ideas of independence and interdependence, which I do talk a lot about in my book, because when you look at lower income groups across the globe, we think that the U.S. is all about, independence and I'm in charge of my life and I'm a self-made person. But there are, whether you look at a communist country or the U.S., it's more about the economic class that you're in. People who are in the higher economic classes they value independence, and the people in the lower economic classes, whether the study I'm referring to is in Russia, so back when Russia was the USSR, whether they were in the lower or higher, if you're in a higher income class, you value independence. If you're in a lower income class, then you tend to value interdependence. And that interdependence, that because you need each other, you work together to survive, whether it's your family unit or your community. When you're in that situation, knowing that you are not alone, that you have the support of others, can really help you get through those moments of crisis. But then once you branch out, then you get to independence, where this is why, the upper classes seem like they don't care about anybody, because the way you get respect and belonging in higher income society is by not needing anybody else. The way you get respect and belonging in a lower income society is by being there for other people. And so it's a cultural issue that stems from economic need. So I think that in those cases, when you're in a resource, all of that long-winded answer is to say that in a resource poor environment, focus on how your social support network can give you that safety net that you need so that you can breathe, so that you have the room to think, and use it. Your social network is a resource that you can use to meet your needs.
And I know that it's a little bit outside of the scope of the book, but I couldn't help but, as I was reading it, think through, potential applications to employment programs, like job programs, where, a lot of times I think they're kind of set up sort of in a similar way of very sort of I want to say similar to the sort of traditional style of budgeting, where it's very transactional of okay, what are your skills? What is the job? What did you do before? Trying to draw sort of straight lines there. And I know there has been some work in that area done by the Behavioral Insights team in the UK. But I didn't know if you had sort of any thoughts, if that was something that maybe got, obviously outside of the scope of this book, but if that was something that you had considered as well, when you're thinking about sort of the obligations that we have as a society, if there are ways to sort of improve those efforts.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about really gets to the other side of the budgeting columns, right? The income side. So we talked about how expenses track to needs, and if you focus on meeting your needs and make sure that you do that, then you're happier on that side. But on the income side of your budget, every stream of income goes back to an asset that's generating that income without exception. Income comes from assets. And I define an asset really simply. An asset is something that earns you more money than it costs you. So, but we don't all have assets, right? But we all have resources, and all an asset is a collection of resources that have been combined in such a way as to generate income in some way. So labor, work, is your time, energy, intelligence being rented out to someone who needs that. If you have a skill, now your labor is more valuable because you can add to time and effort. You can add knowledge and experience and expertise. So when we're thinking about job creation and getting people, into the labor force, I think we really do them a disservice if we don't teach them to take stock of their internal and external resources. What do they love? Because human passion is a boundless resource. But if they just know how to use Word, they're going to be bored out of their minds, and they'll be a terrible employee, and they'll lose their job and be right back in your office.
Very few people's passion is Microsoft Word, I would venture.
Speak for yourself.
At the same time, I have a friend who loves paperwork. She was like, I could do paperwork all day. And I thought, I am so glad that people like you exist. We need people like you.
The world
I
needs
will
your
pay
passion.
you money to do my paperwork. Yes, the world needs her passion. Because I have let so many things go by the wayside because they involved paperwork. The point
I check my mail on maybe a monthly basis. I'd say it's not the greatest habit.
Yeah. So the point being that, I think we could improve those kinds of programs if we get people to be thinking not about, I have to go out and get money. I have to go out and get a job. I'm getting something that's out there. It's really about asking yourself a different question. Again, we're changing the internal environment. We're changing the way that we're framing, but not the way we're framing an external environment, where it's the way we're framing the question. The question isn't, how do I get a job? That assumes that the job is out there for you to go and get. The question is, how do I, based on who I am, what I have, what I am, how do I create value? Because then I have something to give that others want and need and will pay money for. It's a framing issue. Just like instead of framing budgeting, instead of framing your expenses in terms of wants and needs, you frame it in terms of needs and strategy. Instead of framing income in terms of what jobs do I qualify for, you think, what can I do that other people need?
Yeah, and that's going back to the empowerment part. So it's like the both two sides of that. There's like the needs and wants and the strategies of what we're spending, but then there's the other side, which is like how you're actually generating the money you can actually spend anything on. And people just look like, oh, I need a job and I need to get money, but like, it's a skill in and of itself to develop, monetizable skills and a career, not just skills that generate money, like the story you mentioned, where people have these stories where I just need a job that makes me as much money as possible. And so, how do you make as much money as possible doing something that, you're good at and that, you enjoy, and how do you kind of build this life around? That's really, I think, a skill that's not talked about enough, especially in kind of personal finance realms. Like,
and I think that's how you
income, like, is, a lot of times saving money is a lot easier when you can make more. So everybody has random, all of us have random skills that we could probably, generate income for, and for, again, if you're creative about it, like we tend to underestimate how much our skills and passions are worth to the rest of the world.
Yeah, for sure. And I think when it comes down to it, when I started my doctoral degree, I contacted Dan Ariely and I said, I'm thinking about doing an interdisciplinary PhD in psychology and economics, but I'm not sure because I'm wondering if there are jobs on the other side of this degree if I do it that way, or should I do a degree in pure, regular economics and just kind of get a specialty in behavioral stuff. And his answer to me, and this was back in 2008, so this was before behavioral economics was really on people's radar. Nobody had heard of Kahneman at that point. Kahneman and Tversky had done their prospect theory paper, but this is before Nudge, this is before all that, right? And so he said to me, do the traditional behavioral economics route because that's where the professorships are, that's where the jobs are. And I really thought about it. and I decided not to take his advice because I thought, you know what? First of all, that doesn't inspire me. I'm really not inspired by nudges and by that. I was inspired by the idea that we need to make money management more human. We need to understand, we need to connect psychology and economics. And I thought I can't be the only one who's got deep issues with money. I'm going to trust that there will be a market for this, and that risk has paid off. But I think that there's a book that I'm reading right now called The Power of Onlyness. And I really highly recommend it. And it's about this. It's about the idea that you have, because of your perspective, because of your personal history, there is something that you can offer the world that absolutely nobody else can. And if you really figure out what that thing is that other people need that you have, then only you can give it. And in that way, not only are you creating a job for yourself, but you're making yourself irreplaceable. And that's so much more than going and getting a job.
It's funny. I often ask people for advice just to confirm that I don't want to do something as well. But it's actually a great segue to one of the questions that we ask most folks, because we get this question a lot from action design people and people who are interested in behavioral economics, behavioral science. But given what you just said, what are the things that you would maybe recommend for people who are trying to kind of get into the field?
Yeah, I think, this is the second time that somebody asked me this question today. I think what you really have to think about is really what we've been talking about. What is it that you want? What is the problem you want to solve? What is the question you want to answer? It's really hard for me, as somebody who has gone through doing a PhD. I mean, that's the kind of thing that never, ever do a PhD unless the job that you can't live without doing requires it. It's just too difficult. But there are questions that haunted me, that I wanted to answer. I feel like it's more of a mission. I'm on a mission to help people get unstuck, and that is why I have the job I do. That's why I've taken the career path that I have. That's what's driven me, not, oh, there's a job out there that I want, how do I get it? And so it's really hard for me to think in those other terms, because I think if you chase a job, I don't know that you're going to feel satisfied in the end. If it's a job that you want, you find the skills that you need to have. But I think, as in everything that I do, I feel like, why do you want that job? What problem do you want to solve? And become the expert on how to solve that problem.
Yeah, it's funny. I often get questions from students about like, oh, what classes should I take if I want to go into consulting? And my sort of standard response is you should take the classes that you want to take, that you're interested in, because the possible outcomes are either you take a bunch of classes that you aren't interested in because you think that they're going to get you this job, and then either you get the job because you now know these things and can do the stuff that you don't want to do,
that you weren't even interested in,
and now that's your job. Or
right.
You don't get the job, and then you just took a bunch of classes on something that you're interested in. So that answer does resonate with me as well.
Yeah, and you know what? My entire career path hinged on taking one elective course in psychology and financial planning because it seemed really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't need that class. I did not think in any way that was going to help me, that on my resume would help me get a job as a financial planner. It just seems cool.
Yeah.
And here we are. And here you are on the Action Design Podcast, the pinnacle of success.
Who would have thought? So speaking of that, so we're a little over an hour here. I think we could talk about this all night probably and keep expanding on these. But I think to sort of start closing out, like, we talked a little bit about, we've gone through a lot of the stuff on, kind of research on the stories and the internal and the external. And we covered a little bit about the career path. But, for people in their jobs right now who are doing some sort of behavioral work or doing kind of any job serving customers, clients, or even themselves. Like, I think a lot of this resonates we can listen to this and think about how this resonates for ourselves and our own stories. But how can people think about like applying this in their own job to consider, the people that they're serving in their work and the products they're building or the interventions they're developing or whatever? How can they kind of take into account these kind of stories and this internal thinking and not just the external, and really apply it from that behavioral perspective? And maybe we can expand that and start talking and then move into, what are you excited about now and what type of stuff are you working on the most?
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind when you ask that question is that it's, I think that it is really, really useful to listen differently. People are always telling you what their story is, and they're telling you what their needs are. If you listen, every decision that people are making is based on a story they're telling themselves, and they're trying to meet a need. So looking for, what need are your customers meeting? What deep human need? Put it on Maslow's hierarchy and recognize that it matters. And that meeting that need is important to them. And it's not that it's not important because it's just a need to feel cool. We all need to feel important. We all need to feel loved, So just going back to what need are your customers meeting? How are you helping them to self-actualize? And what are the stories? What story are you helping people tell themselves? Is it healthy or not? Those kinds of things. Just seeing, it's not about, so once you learn to see it in yourself, then you can start to see it and hear it everywhere else. And I think that it's, this is the way I frame the world. It's a filter I use, it's like any model. All models are wrong. Some are useful. These are the most useful models I've found. And so I think that also by looking at your job and the service that you provide or the product that you build or the people that you're working with and what they're trying to accomplish and the stories that they're telling about their success on this project and what that means about who they are as a person. There are always stories. There's always a need. So I think just training yourselves training ourselves to think in that way helps us to be, frankly, more authentic. And anything that's rooted in authenticity, I have found, will resonate far more than something that is based on assumptions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just that a lot of it's just like developing good empathy in some ways. Like, and this is a framework for developing empathy for the people you're serving. And you can't ever be. You're never interesting if you please everybody. It's like not necessarily please everybody, but you're interesting when you're authentic and provide a unique point of view. Which, like we mentioned earlier in skills, like everybody has some unique point of view you can share.
For sure, and so everybody's got value they can offer.
Yep. So on that note, I think we'll start closing out and just tell us a little bit. We've obviously we've talked a lot about stuff to learn more about a lot of these concepts. And you can pick up your book Loaded. Where else can people find more of your work or keep track of what you're working on? And is there anything you're particularly focused on now that you're excited about and want to share, and kind of what your next steps are in this sort of stuff?
Sure. So if people want to read kind of the short and sweet versions of some of my research findings, Psychology Today, I have a blog there. So if you go on Psychology Today and search for the Loaded blog or put my name in, you should be able to find those. I also, I'm on Twitter, Finance Therapy. Most of that is just people live tweeting what I say in conference talks, so it's a little bit out of context for anyone else.
So you can catch Sarah on her many world tours around speaking. So, she's probably coming to a city near you at some point in the future.
Probably. And then as far as what I'm really excited about right now, I'm digging deeply into social comparisons. science and how our social comparisons, upward or downward, how the way that we compare ourselves to others and who we choose to compare ourselves to affects our overall financial stress and well-being. And spoiler alert, we all tend to compare to people better off than us or who we think are better off than us, and it makes us feel bad. So I have some advice about how to channel your natural need to compare in a more productive way. So I've got a paper that's going to be coming out about that through Morningstar. And that's where any of the more in-depth research, if you want to read that, other than the book, Morningstar's Behavioral Insights team, we have a website page, and periodically I put out, whenever I do a research study, I write a paper about it. So those come out every couple of months. So if you like reading long format, I would suggest Morningstar's website.
Excellent. Well, any parting thoughts? I think we covered a lot of awesome ground. I'm really excited to kind of listen to this recording and get it out there. But I think if there's any parting thoughts you want to offer, we can close this off for now.
What wise words can I leave you with? It really is
already been some wisdom.
Right? It's funny because you said something about it being obvious, and I was joking with a friend the other day that I feel like my job is telling people the obvious things, but it's only obvious once you see it. And I think that's all of this, that changing your perspective has a profound impact on your life. And just remember that all the financial decisions that you make are inside this framework that's in your mind. And taking a look at that framework, looking at your mental environment around money, will never, ever be time wasted.
Wise words.
Note to end it on.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for jumping out with us and spending a nice deep conversation on all this. This is really great, and we've been looking forward to this for a while. So happy to get it out there in the world now. So thanks again. As mentioned,
thank you guys.
We'll have people. We'll link to some of the resources you mentioned when we publish this out, and we're looking forward to the next steps and what else you come out with.
Great. Thanks, guys. It was fun.
Thanks, Sarah. Bye, Eric.
Thank you.
Bye, action designers.
See you later.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Eric Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available for download on SoundCloud, YouTube, and iTunes. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once more, that is action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States, plus Toronto. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.